just delighted to be here today to talk to you about something that I care deeply about and that I think that you all, because you're here, care deeply about. Why do old places matter? What difference does it make if we either do or do not keep these old places in our community? Why do we preserve these places? So before I delve into these reasons, I want to give you a little background about how I got here and how I started researching this area, or as somebody posted in response to one of my blogs, seems kind of crazy that you even have to ask why old places matter. Well, it partly begins with writing this chapter on historic preservation law in a richer heritage. And in this chapter, I developed the overall theme of the chapter was, until we had a stronger ethic of historic preservation in our communities and in our country, we were unlikely to have stronger laws and stronger policies. And to some degree, I even thought that maybe our laws and policies might sometimes be stronger than the ethic in the country. And at the time, as you heard, I was teaching historic preservation law at the University of Maryland. And I would begin each semester with a discussion about why we have historic preservation law. You know, why do we have the right to tell people what to do with their property or not? And very quickly, this discussion with graduate students in historic preservation and planning and architecture would devolve into why we have historic preservation at all. What are the real reasons for historic preservation? And I was a little stunned to discover that year after year, many of my students didn't have ready answers for why we do historic preservation and why old places matter. So it seemed to me that being able to express the reasons for what we do was critically important to building the ethic and to supporting our laws and policies. So I began to look around at what the statements were. And what I discovered is that they were often very limited, and they often simply reiterated the handful of purposes that are in our statutes and ordinances. So they'll talk about preserving property rights, they'll talk about preserving taxes, they'll talk about saving our heritage, but often wouldn't go beyond phrases like that. They were often brief and not very evocative. And these ideas really hadn't been revisited since this book, With Heritage So Rich, which was published in 1965 and which led to the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act. So I proposed a project to the American Academy in Rome and to the National Trust, where I would go away to Rome for 6 months and look into this question, why do old places matter? And unbelievably, they fell for it. And for 6 months, I went to Rome and studied this idea, why do old places matter? Now, my methodology in doing this was that I wanted to get outside of the preservation world to a certain degree. So I wanted to interview people and talk to people outside of the preservation world. And this is a slide that has a whole cluster of different types of people I interviewed. And many of them were related to preservation in some way, archaeologists, archivists, things like that. But there were also people who were artists or writers or poets or later restaurateurs, developers, a whole host of different types of voices, because I wanted to hear from them why old places matter to them. I also looked into the history of preservation. And I was sort of stunned to discover what an old impulse it is. See this image here? And over there, it's here. That is Dr. Kim Bowes, who's now director of the American Academy, at the hut of Romulus on the Palatine Hill in Rome, which was consciously preserved as a historic site during the reign of Caesar Augustus. This impulse to save old places is a very old impulse. And that's witnessed by this history of preservation, which is really not very well known. So the result of this has been a series of essays published through the Preservation Forum at the National Trust, as well as a forum journal dedicated to the topic. And the real purpose of these essays is to spur a conversation about why old places matter and to build an ethic of saving old places. You can find all of these online by Googling my name along with the word preservation. But remember to include the word preservation, otherwise you get that other unsavory Tom Mays that you don't want to know about. So let me say at the outset, before I start going through the reasons, that I don't think that there is a set number of reasons for why old places matter. I think that place is so all-encompassing and so important that there are literally hundreds of reasons that old places matter to people. And some are present in one place at one time, not in another. Might be relevant to some people at one place and not to others. It might resonate with some and not with others. But what I'd like for you to do as I go through these reasons is to think about which of these resonate with you, and what are the places that go with these words that might make sense to you, and to think about this for yourselves so that when you're talking to people about old places, you can use the words and phrases that make the most sense to you, because being able to do that is the best way we can communicate the value of old places. So, here we go. One of the words I heard most often when I first started talking about this was continuity, that old places give people a sense of continuity. In a world that is constantly changing, old places give people a sense of being part of a continuum that is necessary for them to be psychologically and emotionally healthy. I'm going to read a quote from Maria Lewicka, an environmental psychologist. The majority of authors agree that the development of emotional bonds with places is a prerequisite of psychological balance and good adjustment, and it helps to overcome identity crises and gives people the sense of stability they need in the ever-changing world. We see this sense of continuity in the buildings in our communities. So, for example, this is Caldwell Station School in Caldwell Station, which is the little farming community where I grew up. It is a schoolhouse that my father went to, and it continues there as a preschool today, giving a sense of continuity to all the people in the community. I believe this is Central High School here in Omaha, giving you all that same sense of continuity because of the numbers of people who have gone there and remember their experiences there. We see this sense of continuity most forcefully when the continuity is broken, when there's displacement of people. So this image is Palmer Chapel in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. People were forcibly displaced in order to create that park during the 1930s. And yet, generations later, 3 generations later, those families still go back to this place, to Palmer Chapel, to reconnect with that place. The sense of identity and continuity with that place is so strong that they go back 3 generations later. And this happens all over the world. The lower image on the right is a place called Matera in Italy, where people were forcibly removed from that community that you see for what was supposed to be better housing. And yet our guide's grandmother said, our community has never been the same since we were removed from that place. Old places matter because they give us a sense of continuity. Memory. Old places help us remember. The architect Mary Donati tells her granddaughter, old buildings are like memories you can touch. And I'm looking at Sheila as I say that. Memory is an essential part of consciousness. And without memory, we're hardly ourselves. We all have seen this. when in the way we react to people who have Alzheimer's or who have otherwise lost their memory. It feels like their identity is partially erased. And there is, as the geographers Stephen Holscher and Derek Alderman say, an inextricable link between memory and place. People anchor their divergent memories in place. So there are two different aspects of memory. There's individual memory, and here I use this image from the Cafe Reggio in New York's Greenwich Village, where I used to hang out in my 20s. And it's still there, still looks almost exactly the same. I revisit it often when I go to New York, and I can remember the extremely green country boy I was living in New York City during that period of time. And I can also measure how I've changed in the years since then. That place embeds my memories. And we also have a sense of collective memory, just as Sheila said. And I use here the image of the reflecting pool at the Lincoln Memorial, which even for those of us who haven't been to events at the reflecting pool, it's such a famous image that we all share this memory of the many events that have taken place there, a sense of collective memory. There are even ways that places embed memories we may not even be conscious of. And I use here an image of this cemetery gate, which is the cemetery where I own a plot and will be buried. But you notice anything funny about that cemetery gate? Exactly. There's no wall to go with it. And that's because my frugal Presbyterian ancestors decided to sell the stone wall to the highway department, which I'm still, it happened 3 generations before I was born. I'm still mad about it. But nonetheless, when you see that, it raises questions in your mind, and you immediately know there must have been a wall here. There's a memory embedded there, even though you may not be aware of that memory. Old places serve as mnemonic aids that anchor our memories. Individual identity. Old places embody our identity. People have long recognized this link between place and identity, from Cicero, who wrote about returning to his grandfather's house, to James Marston Fitch, the first head of the preservation program at Columbia, who wrote that preservation affords the opportunity for the citizens to regain a sense of identity with their own origins, of which they have often been robbed by the sheer process of urbanization. Psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and architectural theorists all study the relationship between place and identity, and most agree that place is inextricably linked with the development and maintenance of the continuity of self. There are those who even theorize that identity and place cannot be separated, that people are always in and of place, and that life itself begins and ends in place. We are essentially place. But here's a curious thing. Our sense of identity with place is not static. It changes over time. So this is my great-grandfather's house, which I have a strong identification with, and it's where I grew up. And there's that churchyard again, and there's the old Presbyterian church where I was raised. And those are part of my formative years of identity. But I've also developed a sense of identity with Chapel Hill, where I went to school, with Washington, D.C. and DuPont Circle, and with the American Academy and Rome building. I now have a sense of identity with that. So identity changes over time, but here's one of the things that I found that was really quite curious. And you may be wondering why there's a picture of a 1970s mall on this slide. It is the mall of my junior high school years. And while I was writing this essay, my cousin Stuart, I'm Southern, so I have a lot of cousins. My cousin Stuart, who's the preservation planner for Charlotte, North Carolina, sent me images of this mall because it was getting ready to be demolished, the mall of my junior high school years, which, needless to say, I did not think of as being historic in any way, shape, or form. Well, what stunned me was to find out that a preservation group called PAST had been formed to save this mall. And I was like, well, I need to look into this and find out what it's all about. And they used a lot of the same language that I'm using now, that this mall represented the identity of Charlotte, perhaps more true than you might want to admit, um, and, and that people's memories were embedded here. And then I found out that the demolition company that had been hired to demolish the mall, the head of it had actually set up a memory site where people could leave their memories of the mall on his website because he had himself met his wife ice skating at the mall. So what this led me to understand in a way was that places can become old in only about 30 or 40 years. In one generation, people began to attach memory and identity and continuity to places. So we'll come back and think about that a little bit more, but about 30 years. But older places often embed an even longer time frame of memory, and particularly collective memory. Old places embody our individual identity. Old places also embody our civic, state, national, and even universal identity. So Independence Hall, shown here in the middle, and countless other places embody the history and principles of the United States. And the preservation movement has long championed these types of places. And patriotism and national identity have long been key drivers of the preservation movement. But I noted as I started to talk to people about the reasons old places matter, that people were hesitant to talk about patriotism as a reason. A reticence that reflects what Edward Said described as the vexed issue of nationalism and national identity, of how memories of the past are shaped in accordance with a certain notion of what we, or for that matter, they, really are. In the preservation movement, I think we all have to admit that we haven't always done a good job of being inclusive in the way we think about preservation. We've left slaves out when we talked about the history of plantation houses. Native Americans were treated as the enemy at Western sites. And countless workers and everyday people were left out everywhere that we were preserving places. It's interesting to note, too, that national identity can be manipulated. So here I show what's called the Square Coliseum, down here, over here, which was built by Mussolini during the fascist era intentionally to tie his regime to the history of imperial Rome. So national identity can be manipulated to be exclusive. But here's the thing about old places that I think give them greater power. The continued presence of old places permits and may even foster the acknowledgement of our changed collective memory and identity over time. Like the way slavery is now acknowledged at Monticello and at Mount Vernon, old places often become the vortex where these conversations about our identity take place. They often are places where that conflict can be discussed, and they raise questions that otherwise can't be answered. I use here an image, again from my hometown in Cornelius, North Carolina, of a Confederate memorial. And you can see it's wrapped in blue tarp because it was vandalized or graffitied right after the shootings in Charleston. The fact that that place continues to exist allows us to have a conversation not only about the Civil War, but also about the history of Jim Crow and the history of racism. And it allows that community to have that broader conversation if it chooses to have that conversation. I personally prefer for these places not to be erased. And I don't think it represents the history of the Civil War. I think it represents the history of racism. But the fact that it's there allows that conversation to happen. So these places allow us to have broader discussions about our changing identity than we otherwise might have. So to back out again to a more positive thought, these places also represent our universal world heritage. And I use here the missing image of the Bamiyan Buddhas. When those Buddhas were blown up in order to destroy a religious icon, many of us felt a loss about the destruction of something that was thousands of years old. That loss was felt by all of us because it's part of our collective, universal identity. Old places are part of our ever-evolving collective identity. Beauty. Old places are beautiful. If you Google beautiful places, what you get is a whole lot of natural places, a whole bunch of old places, and just a small smattering of new places. Beauty and the threat to beautiful places was a driving force for preservation efforts at the beginning of the preservation movement. And it remains at the heart of why people care about old places. We all know how much easier it is to save a beautiful building than to save an ugly building. Yet beauty is still, this is for, yes, I talked about beauty as a reason. I found that people were really uncomfortable talking about it. Even though our ordinances are often called aesthetic regulation, people don't often expressly ground their decisions in ideas of beauty. And this is for many reasons. People think it's subjective. People think it's just opinion. And yet, what we have found is that beauty is still something that delights, moves, and satisfies people. A study by the British Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment found that beauty is a deeply positive experience contributing to happiness and well-being, and that it may even change brain function when you experience beauty. But here's the interesting part of preservation and the relationship with beauty. Preservation is the public forum where notions of beauty in our society change. So at the beginning of the 20th century preservation movement, people didn't appreciate Victorian buildings. They thought they were ugly and should be torn down. Then the same was said about Art Deco. I'm at the Deco Hotel. Everybody would say it's beautiful now. The same was said for modern buildings. And then we got into mid-century modern, and you're hearing the conversations about how those are beautiful now. And it even comes to brutalism and whether brutalism is beautiful. I can actually find beauty in many brutalist buildings, which I know people still struggle with. And yet, it is interesting to me that it's preservation where these conversations about what is beautiful actually change and morph over time in our society. Old places matter because they are, or because they may become, beautiful. History. Old places give us an understanding of history that no other documentary evidence possibly can. How? Well, old places are where you experience history with all of your senses, with sight, with smell, with sound. There was a great article in the New York Times this morning about the smell of old places and this experimental way to try to capture that. Yeah, it's interesting. You take a look at it. It's got this weird mechanism to capture the smell of the Morgan Library. It's almost like you're experiencing old places with full body immersion. I show here President Lincoln's cottage in Washington, D.C., which is where Lincoln spent every summer during the Civil War. And people who visit there want to know that they're walking in Lincoln's footsteps. They want to touch the handrail that he touched. They can experience a sense of history with all five senses that they otherwise are not able to do. And here's Emily Dickinson's house, where people say they can understand something about the poetry that she wrote there that they could not understand before they went to the place. And similarly, battlefields, where historians say they couldn't understand the dynamics of a particular battlefield until they actually went to the place. And here in West Virginia, the Battle of Blair Mountain allows us to understand something about labor history and those forces, the desperate struggle for decent working conditions that we cannot understand if we don't preserve that place. The most vivid experience of history is at a historic place. Old places matter because they're our history. Related to history is learning. But broader in a way. It's a traditional function of historic sites to teach. And this is Old Salem, again in North Carolina, where I'm from, where I went on a school visit and where I still to this day remember learning something that I couldn't quite understand about the Moravians in North Carolina and the love feasts that they had and singing a cappella 18th century songs. That, as you all know from going on field trips, often that's the only thing people remember from their history classes, is when they went on a field trip, because of this capacity to have a deeper understanding. But there's something else that happens too. Sometimes we learn something simply by the fact that a place survives. So I show here the Quantide Temple in Mendocino, California, which was built in 1854 by Chinese immigrants to California. And here is one of the descendants of those immigrants, Deborah McCord, talking to us about that place. And what she said was, what people learn when they're here by the simple survival of this place is that we were here. It keeps that knowledge that they, the Chinese immigrants, were actually there. Old places matter because they're unparalleled places to learn. Architecture, and this is architecture with a big A. Old places as architecture are part of our cultural inheritance. We love old buildings that are architecturally significant because they're part of the cultural legacy of all humankind and because of how they make us feel. I remember vividly being in an old plantation house that my father's friend, Jim Withers, used as a barn. And we were unloading hay in this vacant shell of a house. And even then, as a kid, I knew that there was something different about that place. There were tall old rooms, there was architectural detail, there were elegant proportions. And what I didn't realize until later was that I was experiencing balance and proportion and harmony. I just knew I was in a different sort of place. These ideas of balance, proportion, and harmony are still at play in architectural practice, and they're emphasized by the Villa Rotunda here. But there are other ways we think of architecture, such as Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House, a National Trust historic site, where Mies van der Rohe sought to try to experiment with the notion of the inside and the outside and people's relationship to architecture and nature. These ideas are part of our cultural heritage, and they're embedded in these places of architectural significance. And they should be preserved for that reason alone. It's really no different from paintings or sculpture or literature and books. But there is one other idea that I'd like to emphasize. The Finnish architect and architectural theorist Juhani Palasma points out in a recent Forum Journal article for the National Trust that architecture is also important because it places us on the continuum of time. And I use the pyramids here. When we see the pyramids, we're immediately placed on the continuum of time in Western civilization. We know where we fall. And this is equally true for the old places in our communities. They immediately place people on the continuum of time. Architecture is one of the reasons that old places matter. Sacredness. Some old places matter because they're sacred or are considered sacred. People all over the world find places like the Santuario de Chimayo, in this unfortunately dim photo here and here, to be places that move them deeply. They actively seek to experience the feelings I had at that place. From the Wailing Wall of Jerusalem, the Kaaba in Mecca, St. Peter's in Rome, Santiago de Compostela, Japan, India, even New Mexico, sacred places have been revered for thousands of years by people of many different cultures. And there are other ways in addition to the religious that places are considered sacred. Some are sanctified by the things that happen there, like battlefields, which are often treated as being hallowed by the difficult events that happen there, or at other places where, such as sites of conscience, where difficult things happen. Old places matter because they're revered as being sacred. Creativity. Old places spur creativity. I initially wrote this essay as almost a throwaway because I was just interested in this topic, but I've been surprised at how much resonance it's gotten. People are inspired by old places to compose, write, and do other creative work. In the lower photo is RCA Studio A in Nashville, Tennessee, on Music Row, where Elvis recorded, Dolly Parton recorded the song Jolene, and which was recently saved through the efforts of the musician Ben Folds. And it was saved not only as a historic building, but as a building that he felt transmitted an artistic legacy. And he wanted people to be able to continue to use that legacy going forward and to be able to continue to compose and record music in that studio. We see also the studio of Daniel Chester French, who was the sculptor of the Lincoln Memorial statue, the seated Lincoln. And it's a place that continues to be used for artistic endeavors today. So we have a sculptor in residence. We use it to inspire people to continue to create. And the people shown here are Eric Nathan, who's a composer, a contemporary composer, and Judith Shea, who is a contemporary sculptor. I chaired a discussion there about creativity in old places so that they could talk about how old places inspire them to do their creative work. And this is Santa Sabina, a church, a 4th century Christian church in Rome, which inspired Eric to write a piece, which he then titled, Why Old Places Matter. So you can go online and hear this contemporary music piece where he tries to capture the way old places resonate with history and with memory through the use of echoes. It's quite a beautiful, moving piece. But why is this the case, that old places spur creativity? Richard Florida, who's famous for talking about the creative class, says this. He doesn't say why, but he talks about the way the creative class is drawn to old places. And he says, one of the key ingredients, according to him, is authenticity. He says, as in real buildings, real people, and real history is key. So the only study I'm aware of, and I've read a lot of studies over the past 4 years trying to look at this topic of why old places matter. There's only one study that seeks to isolate what difference age makes in a place. And it was done where it sought to look at a part of Charleston, South Carolina, and try to match it as nearly as possible in terms of design with a new urbanist community nearby called Ion. And the conclusion of the study was that people in the real old place in Charleston, as compared to people in Ion, had their imaginations spurred more in the old place than in the new place. which seems to me to tie again to what Sheila said this morning about the city as a library. It raises questions in people's minds that causes them to begin to think about the past and to spur their imaginations. Old places matter because they spur creativity. Ancestry. Old places connect us to our ancestors. Making a connection to our ancestors used to be an express reason we sought to save old places, but over the decades, preservationists have shied away from it. And they've shied away from it because of ideas of exclusivity, ideas of elitism, and things like that. Yet in recent years, there's been an explosion of genealogical interests, such as Ancestry.com and the TV programs. And here's Somerset Plantation, which had one of the first reunions of the descendants of the enslaved people. Here's Chet Atkins talking about how moved he was at a Civil War battlefield where his ancestors fought. And here is Walter Washington, a descendant of George Washington's family at his family home, Harewood, where James and Dolly Madison were married. Again, connecting him to his ancestors. This may sound frivolous, and yet being able to connect with places where people's ancestors lived and worked gives people a deep sense of satisfaction, regardless of whether they were rich or poor, famous, or just folks. It gives them a sense of identity and belonging that is psychologically important to them. Old places matter because they connect us to our ancestors. Sustainability, a different, more practical reason. The architect Carl Elefante says the greenest building is the building that's already built. The reuse of existing buildings results in a large number of sustainability benefits, and you can find these reasons in the studies by the Preservation Green Lab. But I'm going to run through a quick laundry list. The reuse of old buildings results in land conservation because the reuse of the building doesn't require the use of new land. It results in habitat preservation because it doesn't take away natural habitat. It results in open space preservation because new land is not being used. It results in reduced fuel consumption because existing buildings are usually walkable and dense. And it avoids the adverse impacts of demolition and trashing of those materials, and then having new materials shipped from all over the world to build a new place. It's one of the greenest strategies that any community can adopt. It avoids new landfill material. I had a program recently with Brandon Spencer Hartley from Portland, Oregon, who just put in place an ordinance called a deconstruction ordinance. And the quote he gave me was this, that they realized in Portland that their old growth forests were still standing in their existing buildings, that's where the old growth forests were. In addition to the idea of these sustainability benefits, there are even those who say that an old community that has grown organically over time is itself its own human ecology that should be nurtured over time. I don't think the green values of old places have really been fully recognized, but I do think that if it becomes increasingly recognized, it's got the greatest power to shift the paradigm for saving and reusing old places. Old places matter because reusing them is sustainable. Community. Old places foster community. But how? What are the reasons? So, two quick reasons. One, they give us a sense of identity. And we see that in places like post offices, shown here, which are places that people immediately identify with the identity of their community. But they also form community because they give us a place to gather over time. And I show here the place in Menalusa, this house that allows people to come together and form a sense of community where they can meet each other and get to know each other. Old places foster this sense of community. The writer Wendell Berry says, "A community is the mental and spiritual condition of knowing that the place is shared. In the new urbanism world, people promote building new places that are walkable and dense, the things that our old places often already have. And I applaud their efforts to build good new places. If we're building new places, they should be good. And yet, there's something that's missing, and it's the concept of time. We can build places that may become communities later, but it's only in the old place that place and people and time come together to form a community. It's necessary for all three of those elements to be in place. Old places matter because they foster community. Economics. I saved the idea of economics last, not for last in my series of essays. I know that you all have had Don Ripner come here and speak, and he is the international guru on preservation economics. So I'm going to quickly reiterate some of the ideas about why old places matter with regard to economics, but you've heard it from the leading international expert. So old places matter because they support a sound, sustainable, and vibrant economy. And while I don't think we should reduce all of these other values to an economic equation, which is what happens so often in debates about whether we should save old places, fortunately, what we've discovered is that studies actually support the economics of old places. So I'm showing the American Brewery building up here, which is a tax credit project that I'll come back to. Old places attract tourists, as we all know from the people traveling to experience history, learning, beauty, or to take pilgrimages to sacred sites. They attract talent and investment, just like Richard Florida wrote about in his work on the creative class. They serve as incubators for small businesses, as documented in the Preservation Green Lab reports on the reuse of older buildings. They create jobs and good wages, as we know from the rehabilitation studies that have been done here and in other states. And they revitalize neighborhoods and communities. In fact, it's often the only important asset that some communities actually have. And we see that in Main Street communities, where what they have to work with is the old buildings in their community. Some economists, including Don, are trying to capture more of the values in their work in addition to economic values, such as health, walkability, or even happiness. There are happiness measures around the world. But just imagine if these economic studies could capture the full value that old places give people, the sense of identity and belonging, the awe of beauty, creativity, and imagination, then their value would be incalculable. And I think we all recognize that. Through this exploration of these 14 ideas about why old places matter, I've become even more convinced that old places matter deeply to people and to society, and for more reasons than I thought. I'm a lifelong preservationist, and I came out of this project thinking, wow, these places are actually more important to people than I thought they were. Old places are necessary for our psychological and emotional health. They ground us with a sense of belonging. They inspire us in creativity. They soothe us with beauty and sacredness. They help us know who we are. I put this photo of the American Brewery back up because I used it in a presentation at the American Academy in Rome. It's a tax credit project done by the National Trust subsidiary, the National Trust Community Investment Corporation. I was stunned when, after my presentation, a woman at the Academy came up to me, and she suffers from a debilitating disease. She had been a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, near where this is located. And she had tears in her eyes, and she said, I want to tell you that as that building was being rehabbed, I had just discovered I had this disease. And on my way to Hopkins, I would intentionally walk by it as it was being restored because it gave me a sense of hope that I might be able to be restored in some way. This building gave her a sense of hope. So knowing this story, I was then stunned about a year ago to see this image crop up in the news. It was after riots broke out in Baltimore. And this building survived a fire, the building being built nearby. And in the New York Times, the Reverend Dante L. Hickman, Jr. from New Shiloh Baptist Church was interviewed about what happened in his community around here. And he talked about his plans to rebuild. He spoke about creating a workforce development program, health services, life coaching, mortgage lending. He pointed to a broad field across the street from that the church had acquired to build a youth center and an abandoned laundry that he hopes to convert to more housing. We have a mantra, he said. We restore people as we restore buildings. I think this is why old places matter, old buildings, because they have the power to fulfill deep and fundamental human needs. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Why do old places matter to you? Thank you all.